Welcome to It's Your Ego, Stupid, a show lovingly intended for millions of spiritual, intelligent, and imperfect people like you who may at times be led into ego stupidity, a lesser version of yourself and a lesser version of life. This show will give you a much deeper understanding of what ego is, what it's doing to your life, how it can weaken your human and spiritual wellness, and how you can heal in each of these areas if needed. It's Your Ego, Stupid will heighten your awareness of the intense link between your ego and spirit, your humanity and divinity, and the synergy that can lead to the best version of you and your life. Your host is Dr. Nick Martin, a licensed psychologist who has worked in the clinical, university, school, and private practice settings over the past 40 years, while serving as a therapist, diagnostician, educator, and consultant. Welcome again to It's Your Ego, Stupid. And now your host, Dr. Nick Martin.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Nick Martin, and thank you for listening to It's Your Ego, Stupid on OMTimes Radio. I hope that you've had a great week as you go about meeting the many important challenges that we all face, which during today's show will have us focusing on genuine happiness and how higher ego vulnerability can get in the way of our ability to experience it. It's Your Ego, Stupid is a program for spiritual, intelligent, and imperfect people, just like you and me, who may at times be led by our ego into something I call ego stupidity, a lesser version of ourselves, and a lesser version of life. Ego stupidity that can be affecting relationships with family, friends, co-workers, and even ourselves that could stand some improvement, maybe a lot of improvement. Lots of destructiveness and distance taking place involving poor communication, inability to compromise around needs that meets everybody's needs, that is, a lack of compassion and empathy rooted in ego energy issues, ego stupidity that can be impacting our efforts to achieve and to be successful, to experience a sense of meaning to our life, coming to know our life's purpose, and getting on with our life's work. Lots of people are reporting dissatisfaction with their station in life, a lacking sense of direction, fear of failure, feeling lost, and a sense of meaninglessness rooted in ego energy issues. Ego stupidity affecting one's ability to deal effectively with all of the changes, adversity, stressors, and conflicts that take place in our life, often leading to their managing us rather than our managing them. Again, rooted in ego energy issues. Ego stupidity, making it difficult to grow our mind with truth while keeping us stuck in faulty beliefs, values, attitudes, and prejudices, many nowadays acquired from unfiltered social media, fake news on the internet, and opinion news on TV, masquerading as truth. Ego stupidity, making it difficult to feel genuine, lasting happiness, the focus of our program today, while often leading us into unneeded anxiety, anger, guilt, sadness, or fake happiness being substituted for the real thing. And finally, ego stupidity impacting our spiritual wellness and ability to be the love, the life, and the energy God is within our daily thoughts, words, and deeds. As you can see, there are lots of important places that ego stupidity can make its appearance in our lives. If you're an intelligent, spiritual being and a mentally stable person, and you are, and things aren't going as well as you'd like, you've come to the right place. Because a lot of what's going wrong has nothing to do with our intelligence. It has nothing to do with the absence of our spirituality, and nothing to do with our being mentally ill, and has a lot more to do with our ego energy, serving as the fuel for ego stupidity. Your lives, relationships, and experiences have taught me all of that over the past 40 years, and what I'm sharing with you in my shows, books, and website about ego energy and ego stupidity, and how we can heal it with ego medicine when and where needed. Again, thank you for tuning in to It's Your Ego Stupid on OMTimes Radio. During our show today, we're going to continue focusing on our ability to experience genuine happiness, an important part of life, I think you'll agree, and what higher ego vulnerability can be doing to get in the way of that happening. Ego vulnerability that often leads to significant amounts of anxiety, anger, or guilt that makes it impossible to experience genuine happiness or even to know what it is. Higher ego vulnerability that is standing in the way of working with the ingredients, the gatekeepers or routes to experiencing genuine happiness you've taught me that are the foundation to experiencing lasting genuine happiness, such as being at peace with yourself, others in the world, being motivated by love in your dealings with people and life rather than anger, fear, or guilt, being connected to a sense of your life's purpose, humanly and spiritually, which is intimately connected to your sense of service in whatever you're doing right now. Being free of inappropriate expectations of yourself, of others, and from others. And finally, being able to love and accept yourself just as you are while being willing to grow. Each of these are made more difficult when higher ego vulnerability energy is at work in your life. So ask yourself, how am I doing in these areas? Is there a need for growth or improvement? If there is, it's very likely your ego energy is getting in the way and distancing you from genuine happiness. Again, today's program will be looking at the impact of higher ego vulnerability on genuine happiness, an issue that millions of people are experiencing, often linked to difficulty accepting and working with the weaknesses and imperfections of themselves, others, and the world. Difficulties that often have them spending much of their emotional life in some degree of fight or flight physiology and feeding into lots of anxiety, anger, and guilt-related thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, each creating loss of distance from experiencing genuine happiness, with some of them living in roles such as the high-maintenance partner who often needs constant reassurance from their mate, or the perfectionist who is too obsessed with getting things just right. I wonder who that reminds me of. The stressed out person who often finds things to get stressed out about. And the traumatized person who hasn't resolved previous life challenges, each of them and others that I talk about in my book, The Two Voices Within, who are having difficulty feeling genuine happiness. They aren't at peace with themselves, other, or the world, because they often meet them with fear rather than love. They're feeling restless, unsettled, frustrated, and resentful of people, life, and the world they see as being the source of their stress and suffering. They have difficulty coming from a place of love in their dealings with life due to the emotions of anxiety, anger, and guilt that are dominating their motivation, leading to thoughts and behaviors making happiness difficult to experience. They don't experience an inner sense of purpose rooted in service to others, human and divine, due to feelings of insecurity and inferiority that are weakening belief in themselves and their efforts to be of service. They often take on expectations and make demands of themselves, others in life that are distorted by their heightened sense of vulnerability, often asking more of themselves and others than is appropriate or necessary, and often leading to feelings of discouragement and failure while overlooking the situation at hand. They're having great difficulty accepting themselves as they are, while being consumed with their imperfections and vulnerability, which they may try to resist or deny, rather than working with, managing, and learning from them. Now, does any of this sound familiar to you? Because millions of people experience these difficulties, as there are billions of people on the planet, and every one of them has an ego, just like you and me. I want you to take a look to see if you or somebody you know, live with, or work with is experiencing any of the symptoms, ego stupidity, and ego impact on spiritual wellness affecting happiness that I'll be talking about today. I want you to diagnose you because you're the only one living you 24/7. So now we're going to take a look at some of the symptoms to see if a higher ego vulnerability voice is talking to and through you in your life. And the first one, you're unable to experience genuine happiness. People with higher ego vulnerability have a very difficult time feeling happy. So some questions connected to that. When was the last time you felt happy? And how long did it last if it did happen? Did you have to do anything to experience it? I want to mention that I'm not talking about pseudo-happiness or fake happiness or pleasure-based happiness. This is often interpreted as being what happiness is about for many people, but it's not. It doesn't deal with those 5 things I mentioned earlier about peace and coming from a place of love. You were designed to be happy. You were designed to be that calm and still, accepting and loving and serving being to yourself and to others. But happiness isn't about doing anything as much as it is about being. Being that's possible when your ego energy is in a healthy place. So experiencing genuine happiness is often very difficult for people with higher ego vulnerability. The next symptom, you lack understanding of the things that allow you to experience happiness. So questions that go along with this symptom, are you familiar with the ingredients of genuine happiness, the ones that I've mentioned earlier? And has that ever even occurred to you? Do you think that happiness is something you feel when you're not anxious or angry? Meaning that when you don't feel as anxious as you maybe normally feel or feel as guilty or as angry, that somehow is reflective of happiness. Well, that's really just the absence of unhappiness, but the absence of unhappiness doesn't necessarily mean that you're experiencing happiness. And do you try to create happiness with pleasure-based alternatives? Again, those are some of the things that people do to feel happy or to think they're feeling happy. Things that may deal with food or alcohol or drugs or other forms of entertainment within and of themselves are not necessarily a bad thing, except those are not really the basis for why we are experiencing or should be able to experience happiness. So that is the second symptom. Here's the third one. You create many fear or anger-based thoughts, making it difficult to experience genuine happiness. People with higher ego vulnerability often feel emotions like anxiety and anger, and that often leads into the direction of thinking angry thoughts and anxious thoughts or fearful thoughts. So is it easy for you to think anxious thoughts about yourself or people or the world, meaning that you're able to find things fairly readily to be fearful of? Or is it easy for you to think angry thoughts? Again, finding things to be angry about. Some people are very good at finding things to be upset about, to feel angry about, or to be fearful of, as I said before. When you feel anxious or angry, do you look outside of yourself to explain it? Much of the time when people are experiencing these kinds of feelings, they look outward. They look at things outside of themselves to see if they can come up with answers as to why they feel anger or fear and why it's justified. Instead of looking inside, which is for many people much more difficult. And the reason for that is because people often don't know what to look for on the inside or where to go on the inside. Well, in response to that idea, I would say, but that's what I'm here for, to help you go inside, to look inside, particularly at the inside of your energy, the ego energy that's at work in your life that you often don't realize. I'm going to mention one more symptom as we come toward the first break. You temporarily escape your anger or anxiety with diversions and distractions. People with higher ego vulnerability often are looking for ways to gain some distance, to take them away from these rather unpleasant feelings, particularly the more intense they are. They feel a need to do that. And so some of the answers they get come in the form of maybe using drugs or alcohol, or maybe using food or different types of media or entertainment that are used to create distance from these unpleasant emotions. So how have these kind of things become a necessary part of your daily routine? That is, your daily routine to try to experience some semblance of what you think is happiness. Does your day feel empty when you haven't had them, when they're not part of what's going on in your day? And do you realize that the more you need them, the more unhappy you're likely to be, the more dependent you are becoming on these sources of fake happiness to substitute for genuine happiness? It's as if what you're trying to do is turn off the anxiety or the anger or the guilt temporarily. And again, these can often be the foundations of addictions because they often get hardwired into what we call our autonomic or involuntary nervous system. I want to mention that he didn't get to all the symptoms, but you can see them in the free download of It's Your Ego Stupid. And you don't have to have all of them or any of them all of the time. But the more the symptoms you have and the more often they happen, the stronger the indication that you are experiencing higher ego vulnerability that needs to be healed. And you'll also need to consider the symptoms over time to get a clearer picture of what's going on, because our ego energy can hide quite well from us, even though it's often in plain sight for others to see, hiding from us due to the prism we're looking through to know ourselves and our life. We're coming up on our first break. When we return, we'll be looking at some reflections of ego stupidity connected to difficulty experiencing genuine happiness. This is Dr. Nick. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid on OMTimes Radio, and I'll see you after the break.
Conscious media for conscious minds. OMTimes. Being a radio host on IOM-FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
My name is Victor Furman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio, and we'll explore these topics and so much more on Destination Unlimited.
Hi, Dr. Nick Martin here. I want to invite you to visit my website, egoandspirit.info, where you can find lots of information on ego and download your free ebook copy of It's Your Ego Stupid. Fix it to fix your life. Also, please visit the shop page where you can find each of my other books, Ego Therapy, Ego Spiritualism, and The Two Voices Within.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid on OMTimes Radio, a show for intelligent, spiritual, and imperfect people, just like you and me. Now we're going to take a look at reflections of ego stupidity and when it's happening in a higher ego vulnerability person's ability to experience genuine happiness. Now, some of them can seem odd or strange or weird or funny, maybe inappropriate, but that's because you're not living in that energy. But for those with higher ego vulnerability, it can lead them to engage in ego-rooted, non-reality-based thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, particularly those involving happiness. And it can often lead them to conclude that the abnormal things that they're thinking or feeling or doing are normal or are reasonable or should be expected. But they're not. And like the symptoms, they can become their abnormal normal that they don't realize they're caught up in. But others often can because they aren't looking at this person through the same ego energy prism that the higher ego vulnerability person is looking through to see what's going on in their life, to see themselves. And this has nothing to do with their intelligence or the absence of spirituality or being under the influence of a mental illness. Because we are intelligent and we're spiritual and we're imperfect people. But we can get caught up in the web of an abnormal world of our own making due to our own unhealthy, imbalanced ego energy. And we can remain stuck there until we heal the energy within us that's leading us to create them. And we can do this with the use of ego medicine that consists of knowing what ego is and isn't, getting to the truth about what our ego is, an energy that's at work in our life, trying to help us, but often perhaps leading us astray. And also being able to tune into our ego energy, meaning getting a greater sense of the amount of our ego power and the amount of our ego flexibility and the amount of our ego vulnerability. Each of those are parts of this energy that I offer lots of examples across my books, within the website, and even within our different podcasts to give you a better idea of just where are you at with regard to your ego energy and how much work and where do you need to do the work in order to bring it into a healthier balance for you so that you can live a greater life. And also the third ingredient to ego medicine is being able to replace ego-rooted, non-reality-based, truth-disconnected thoughts and beliefs that we created. Ego did not make them or create them. We did. We just built them upon that energy that is flowing into our mind, and we replaced them with those that are truth-connected, both human and divine. And that's what the next part of our program is about, is looking at that third contributor to ego medicine involving the reflections of ego stupidity. So here is the first reflection. Happiness can't exist for me. Some people are so used to being less happy or unhappy or not happy, that they get to thinking that happiness can't exist for them. Now, that's a non-reality based thought because the more accurate thought is likely to be happiness doesn't exist for me now. But as I said earlier in the program, we were designed to be happy. We were designed to be able to be at a place of peace and to come from a place of love and to be able to offer service and all the other ones that are part of fundamentally being happy. But it requires an understanding of what you're looking for to experience it, which is what we're talking about within today's program, as well as how to get there. So when you're thinking that happiness can't exist for you or for me, you are thinking a non-reality-based thought that needs to be replaced by the reality-based thought that happiness can be a part of my life. as long as I learn to understand what it truly is and how to get there. Until you're thinking that, and you're thinking happiness can't exist for me, it's your ego making you stupid. Another reflection. Genuine happiness and pleasure-based happiness are the same thing. So often when people are living in a world, an emotional life, particularly when there's so much distress or stress, whether it's anger or fear or guilt, and they begin to make use of pleasure-based happiness options as a strategy to feeling happy, to feeling something that sounds like happiness, they resort to those pleasure-based alternatives, some of which I mentioned earlier. And that can often cause a blurring effect because a person doesn't understand the difference, doesn't know the difference between the two. And some of that can have to do with our socialization, how we were raised, and perhaps what people have taught us, what advertisements have taught us about what it means to be happy in your life. What it means, how do you get to feel happy? Has anybody ever heard of the Happy Meal? And this blurring is due to never having experienced the real thing sometimes. We've never gotten to that place. Unfortunately, people who grew up in some difficult situations, maybe they were exposed to a lot of abuse or a lot of neglect of different kinds over time that made life very challenging and happiness very difficult to even know what it would be, because the people who were supposedly able to teach them that were not doing a very good job, if at all. So sometimes that can lead to training ourselves to think of what pleasure-based happiness is, the fun feelings that we may get, as being the real thing, but it's not. So when we are caught up in thinking that they're both the same thing when they're not, that's our ego making us stupid. Another reflection of ego stupidity is the idea that the absence of anger or fear or guilt is happiness. Meaning that if I'm not feeling those unhappy emotions, that I'm happy. Well, that's not right, because the opposite of unhappiness isn't necessarily happiness. There's sort of a middle ground that may occur when we just stop feeling, and maybe there's a feeling of relief for people who've been feeling a lot more of that tension, that stress. But the absence of that tension or that stress doesn't mean we are in a place of happiness. And if we don't realize that, then we may not really get onto the idea or understanding that what genuine happiness is and what we must do to work on getting to that place, rather than simply accepting the absence of unhappy or unpleasant emotions like anxiety and fear is reflective of happiness. But when we're thinking that idea and we're working and using that idea in our life, well, that's your ego making you stupid. Another reflection of ego stupidity. My feelings of anxiety, anger, or guilt are legitimate. My feelings of anxiety, anger, or guilt are legitimate. Now, you are feeling those feelings. They're real. Legitimacy is about, is there a reason to be feeling them? And a lot of times, the answer is no. People with higher ego vulnerability often find all kinds of things. I said earlier, they can easily find things to be angry about, or they can easily find things to be fearful of. So a lot of times people may take their emotions at face value without questioning the reason for why they're experiencing them. Feeling to understand the role maybe that they're playing in creating those emotions. Failing to understand the role that you're playing in distancing yourself from happiness. So this idea that because I'm feeling something makes that legitimate, for people with higher ego vulnerability, that is not the case. They're often coming from a place where they're just taking the emotion again at face value. So when you're thinking feelings are legitimate that are not and they're going unquestioned, that's a reflection of your ego making you stupid. One more. I can create genuine happiness. People who are caught up in difficulty feeling genuine happiness, in some respects, are thinking that they can take a shortcut. And this is often built on the idea that fake happiness or false happiness that you have experienced from strategies are reflective of happiness when they're not. You can create fake happiness or pleasure-based happiness, and that's something many people do because they're having tremendous difficulty getting the real thing. But unfortunately, that thought is making it difficult for them to recognize and realize that what they're seeking and what they're getting and what they're creating isn't true and genuine happiness. So when your ego is having you think that, that's removed from reality, and that is reflective of ego stupidity. And I'm going to mention one more. You can't have genuine happiness and pleasure. That you can't have both of those. You can either have one or the other. And that's not true. That's not reality-based thinking. We can. You can experience genuine happiness, all those things that I've mentioned at the beginning of the program. And you were also able to experience pleasure. The pleasure of listening to great music or watching a great movie or reading a good book or sexual experiences and great food. All that you were designed to experience pleasure as part of your life. The only problem with pleasure is when it becomes perceived as the basis for happiness, which it isn't. It's a part of life we can experience, but it's not the same thing as happiness. So when we get confused about what genuine happiness is and what pleasure is and what that means as far as genuine happiness, that's our ego leading us to be stupid. I want to now shift over to some insights tied in with what we've been talking about, connected to the symptoms and the ego stupidity. These are insights that can help you to better see what's going on behind the scenes and beneath the surface when it comes to experiencing genuine happiness. These insights are intended to help you see more of your ego blindness and what ego is actually doing when it comes to difficulties experiencing genuine happiness that's lasting. Here's the first one. Your higher ego vulnerability voice is leading you to abandon your search for genuine happiness by concluding it doesn't exist or that it can't exist for you. The more time you are spending and the effort you're putting into fake happiness, the greater this abandonment. And your ego voice, your higher ego vulnerability voice, it's stopping you from realizing that they can be a part of your life. Each of those 5 ingredients, being at peace, coming from a place of love, accepting yourself as you are, and so on, are all being interfered with by the presence of this energy. The next insight is that your higher ego vulnerability voice is preventing you from knowing the difference between genuine happiness and pleasure-based happiness. It's contributing to that blurring or that blockage of knowing the difference between the two. And part of it is because it has the upper hand in what I would call the near term. Your higher ego vulnerability energy can often lead you to experience those unpleasant physiological experiences that can distance you more quickly, that the pleasure-based happiness, I'll call them solutions, can lead to removing this. And that's why addictions are very powerful, because they become, in some respects, hardwired into your mind and into your emotional reactions. And that's why people self-medicate oftentimes, is because it provides the opportunity to get some relief from the pain and the suffering and the misery they may be getting from the intense emotions they have been afflicted with. So that gets in the way of our being able to distinguish effectively between genuine and pleasure-based happiness. The next insight is that your higher ego vulnerability voice is leading you to interpret the absence of anxiety or fear or guilt as genuine happiness. And it's often leading you to settle for a lesser version of life, a lesser version involving the absence of genuine happiness, but also the absence of some of the more intense, unpleasant emotions that we've been talking about. But it's really not enough to be free of unpleasant emotions as much as they may cause you to feel relieved. There is definitely more work to be done involving the ego energy and bringing it into balance so that you can get on with genuine happiness. And one more insight I'll mention here, your higher ego vulnerability voice is leading you to miss the role that healthy amounts of anger, anxiety, and guilt can have or can serve in leading you to the ingredients of genuine happiness. Your higher vulnerability energy has led you to view these emotions only as enemies to be avoided. But there are times and places where these kinds of emotions, be they anger or anxiety or guilt, can actually lead us in the right direction to work toward getting a greater sense of peace or acting in a more loving way. Unfortunately, we don't come to know them as friends that can provide some of these emotional guidelines and reference points that can be used to lead us toward each of the ingredients to happiness. These are some of the reflections of ego stupidity and some of the insights involving ego's voice. Again, there are many more in my book, It's Your Ego Stupid, available as a free download on the homepage of my website, egoandspirit.info. We're coming up on our second break. When we return, we're going to be looking at ego's impact on our spiritual wellness. This is Dr. Nick. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid on OMTimes Radio, and I'll see you after the break.
The Real Conscious Connection. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
OMTimes magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. Connect at OMTimes.com. OMTimes, creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers, pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
Hi, Dr. Nick here. I want to invite you to visit my website, egoandspirit.info, where you can find lots of information on ego and download your free ebook copy of It's Your Ego Stupid. Fix it to fix your life. Also, please visit the shop page, where you can find focused ego meditations that can help you know whether you are truly speaking with your voice in your life or ego is speaking for you.
Melissa from Michigan. I work an extra part-time job serving lunch at my child's school, but I still can't afford to put food on our table.
Daniel from California. Choosing whether to pay the rent or pay to fix the car to get to work doesn't leave us with much at all. Now we can't even pay for meals.
Hunger is a story we can end. End it at feedingamerica.org. brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
Welcome back. You're listening to It's Your Ego Stupid on OMTimes Radio, a show for intelligent, spiritual, and imperfect people just like you and me. During this last portion of today's program, we're going to be looking at the ego's impact on spiritual wellness. But before we get to that, there were a couple more insights that I did want to share with you. I think they're particularly important in the context of today's program. So I want to take care of that. I want to look at those two things first, and then we'll go ahead. The next insight was that your higher ego vulnerability voice is stopping you from realizing that you're the source of the anxious, anger, and guilt-ridden thoughts that you create, and which are distancing you from genuine happiness. In a way, this is what's helping you look outward rather than inward. If you are looking inward, you begin to see more of what we are doing in creating the life we're living in creating the lack of happiness that we may be experiencing. So often, like I said this earlier in the program, we look outside of ourselves to find answers rather than inside. And part of that is because we don't know where to look and we don't know what to look for. But this is an important insight, understanding that we are the source of the things that we're experiencing, that we're feeling, that we're creating these things. And that's rooted in this ego energy. The second insight that I wanted to get to here is that your higher ego vulnerability voice is leading you to reject your weaknesses and your imperfection and vulnerability rather than working to accept them and to work with them on the path to genuine happiness. It has led you to gaining distance from your humanity rather than establishing a healthy connection to it. It has really oftentimes led you to become unfair to yourself and at times inhumane to yourself and others. This is a conversation I've often had in therapy with people who were really getting down on themselves and attacking themselves and failing to recognize and accept the humanity, their humanity, and often attacking themselves in ways that I called inhumane through the negative self-criticism that they almost relentlessly directed toward themselves. This is something I remember speaking to many clients about, is how unfair they were being to themselves. And I wasn't just trying to be supportive of them. I was trying to help them understand that they were leaving a lot of things out about what's going on in their life, in the context of their life, that was making things challenging and difficult. And so in some ways they were being inhumane. They were failing to recognize their humanity, and they were being unfair to themselves. So those are a couple more insights that I wanted to share with you. Thank you for letting me do that. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about ego's impact on spiritual wellness and how higher ego vulnerability can impact our ability to experience spiritual wellness as well as to experience happiness. We're looking here at the ego's impact on the connection to the divinity within our humanity. This involves the lessening of our spiritual wellness, gaining distance from being the love, the life, and the energy God is within our thoughts, words, and deeds, when our ego energy is getting in the way of experiencing happiness. The ego is getting in the way of being the unconditional, the connective, the unburdened, and the unlimited love that God is in our thoughts and our feelings and behaviors as we go about experiencing happiness. That ego is getting in the way of being able to recognize the presence of God in all life forms, including ourselves, as well as honoring and respecting others at all times and in all places as we go about experiencing happiness. And the ego is getting in the way of being able to access the healing and transformative energy that God is within our being when we work with human and divine truth to experience happiness. Again, each of these can be undermining our spiritual wellness by distancing us from God, the God within us, our divinity. So here are some examples of ego's impact on spiritual wellness for those with higher ego vulnerability. And we're going to start with being the love God is. People with higher ego vulnerability are having difficulty being spiritually well and happy when their ego is standing in the way of being the unconditional, connective, unlimited, and unburdened love God is. Your genuine happiness can't exist when concerns about weakness and imperfection are affecting the offering and receiving of love. Your genuine happiness can't exist when your love is connective to some and not others. Your genuine happiness can't exist when concerns about weakness and imperfection are placing limits on the love you are willing to offer and receive. Your genuine happiness can't exist when concerns about weakness and imperfection are making the love you offer burdensome to you. When each of these are happening, you're disconnecting from your spirituality and you're less spiritually well. Another ego impact on our spiritual wellness and happiness. People with higher ego vulnerability have difficulty being spiritually well and happy when their ego is leading them to create unloving thoughts and words and deeds in order to manage their lives. Your divinity doesn't involve using unloving thoughts or words and deeds, many of them often filled with anger or fear or guilt, each of which are incompatible with experiencing genuine happiness. Your divinity doesn't involve using unloving thoughts, words, and deeds containing anger, fear, or guilt, undermining your ability to be at peace with yourself, others, in the world. Your divinity doesn't involve using thoughts, words, and deeds of anger, fear, or guilt, often leading you to reject and not accept the imperfections of your humanity. So when each of these are happening, you're disconnecting from your spirituality and you're less spiritually well. Now we're going to take a look at ego's impact on being the life God is. People with higher vulnerability have difficulty being spiritually well and happy when their ego is leading them to dishonor themselves with rejection of their weaknesses and imperfections. Your divinity and being the life God is involves honoring and respecting the weaknesses and imperfections of your humanity, even as you work to learn and grow from them. And this is an honor and respect that allows you to work with them rather than experiencing anger or anxiety or guilt and unhappiness that often comes when you're preoccupied or you're consumed or you're engaged in the denial of them. So when this isn't happening, you're disconnecting from your spirituality and are less spiritually well. Another ego impact. People with higher vulnerability have difficulty being spiritually well and happy when their ego is leading them to dishonor others with rejection of their real or perceived weaknesses and imperfections. Your divine connection and being the life God is involves honoring and respecting the weaknesses and imperfections of their humanity as you work to support them in their efforts to learn and grow from them. So failing to do so is often rooted in feelings of anger, fear, or guilt, each being their own version of unhappiness. So when this isn't happening, you're disconnecting from your spirituality and you're less spiritually well. Last, we're going to talk a little bit about being the energy God is and ego's impact on it. Being able to recognize the availability of healing and transformative energy within your being when you're connected to human and divine truth. This is a capacity, as I've said before, 3 million years in the making. Your and my divine age are built on the love, life, and energy God is, which has led to your incredible design. A design includes your ability to experience genuine happiness when ego isn't getting in the way. And by the way, our divine ages are the same because the God within our being is of the same age. So here's an impact of ego on spiritual wellness and happiness involving higher ego vulnerability. People have difficulty being spiritually well and happy when healing and transformation is being undermined by the rejection of their humanity. Your divine connection doesn't allow for healing and transformation to occur if you're putting off the acceptance of your humanity until a later time when you have become a better version of yourself. Your healing and transformation is meant to happen now, in the present, where happiness can only happen, with no prerequisite for its occurrence involving your acceptance. And so when this isn't happening, you're disconnecting from your spirituality and you're less spiritually well. And now I'm going to talk about one more impact on spiritual wellness and happiness. People with higher vulnerability have difficulty being spiritually well and happy when their healing and transformation is being undermined by the rejection of the humanity of others. Your divinity doesn't allow for healing and transformation if you're failing to accept the humanity of others represented in their weaknesses, their imperfections, and their vulnerability. Being genuinely happy is incompatible with this rejection. Your healing and transformation can only happen when you accept and you support people within the recognition of the limits and the limitations of their humanity. And when this isn't happening, you're disconnecting from your spirituality and you're less spiritually well. Well, as we leave our focus on ego's impact on our spiritual wellness, I want to say that we often make God and our connection to God so much harder than it has to be, which is exactly what's happening when ego is getting in between us. God and life and we become so much better and so much easier when we can remove that obstacle. Now I want to offer you a frame of reference for knowing when you're healing from higher ego vulnerability and you're able to experience genuine happiness. All of the symptoms and the ego stupidity and ego's impact on spiritual wellness I referred to earlier was when ego is speaking for you and through you. When you're healing your higher ego vulnerability, this is what your voice will be speaking. This is an excerpt from the Two Voices Within. My imbalanced ego has led me to believe that my happiness could be known by the distance I had gained from my human vulnerability. I now recognize this belief as a renouncement of myself, in which no happiness could truly lie. There can be no happiness with ignorance or rejection of myself, only suffering, misery, and an illusory chase for something that cannot exist under the conditions I had placed upon it. My rejection of the illusions of separation, inequality, and unworthiness have eliminated my fear of my vulnerability, opening the door to knowing genuine happiness within my truth, human and divine, and the recognition of the divine gifts I have been given. Again, the words of your voice when healing from higher ego vulnerability. As we leave our focus on higher ego vulnerability and difficulty experiencing genuine happiness, please give some thought to the symptoms, the ego stupidity, and the insights and the spiritual impact that I shared with you. And if any of that resonates with you, please help me to share it with others. Well, we've come to the end of today's program. I hope what I've shared with you can serve as a dose of ego medicine, assisting you in your effort to know true happiness. Our program next week is going to focus on lower ego vulnerability energy and difficulty experiencing genuine happiness. These are people whose emotional experiences are often emotionless, as they have difficulty feeling emotions such as anxiety, fear, guilt, anger, and love. And they're unable to experience genuine happiness while often instigating situations that may allow them to experience excitement, arousal, and so on. I do want to mention before leaving that you can purchase each of my books, Ego Therapy, Ego Spiritualism, The Two Voices Within, and It's Your Ego Stupid at the online bookstores for Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Balboa Press. I want to thank you for listening and allowing me to be your servant. I also want you to have a great week, and please come back to my next program. In peace and love, this is Dr. Nick saying goodbye for now.